Yesterday we were talking about Bernard's, one of his most basic intuitions, which is that when we come to speak about desire for God, it's not something that depends on the human will for its origin, but rather something that is part of human nature itself. All the will has to do is to consent to follow nature, and to follow nature it has to find nature. I'm going to say the same thing again today, just in case you're a bit dull. But I'm going to say it in a slightly different way. Going to go back to scratch and to look at the great image which St. Bernard used to describe that, which was the image of the image of God. That human being is made in the image and likeness of God. The famous text in Genesis 1:26-27, which provided the starting point for the anthropology of just about all the fathers. And this text, you know, there are a number of points that we could make just in general about the way in which it was interpreted. First, in the Vulgate version of it, the word used for "let us make" is faciamus, which those of you who are good at these sort of things would know is plural. And so many of the fathers saw in the text an indication of the Trinity. And so, particularly in the schools in the 12th century, less so in monastic circles, there was an emphasis on the tripartite nature of the soul, that the Trinity is reproduced in human beings. We find this a bit in the Augustinian school and people like William of St. Thierry. For St. Bernard, it's not very important. That the Trinity is stamped on us, and that we bear within ourselves the seal of the Trinity. And that's the first theme. The second theme was the distinction between image and likeness. Because they didn't know much about parallelism or Semitic style of writing, they convinced themselves, particularly from the Alexandrian school, that if the scriptures used two words, they must be referring to two realities. And so they went on to distinguish what is the image and what is the likeness. Well, all of them came up with a different answer, of course, just to make our life abominable. But in general, among the Cistercians, the idea was that the image is something permanent. We remain the image of God even after sin, but through sin we lost the likeness of God. And so we remain God's image, but all our life we have to try and become more and more like God, to grow in the likeness of God. We've lost the likeness, so we remain his image, but we must become more and more like God. And the image, or the metaphor that was often used to signify our state of not being like God, our state of sin, was a Platonic term which we'll meet occasionally, the region of unlikeness, regio dissimilitudinis, that we live in the region of alienation from God and thereby alienation from ourselves. So that's the second theme. And the third theme, which is very, very important for Bernard, also comes from an accident in the Vulgate text. And that is that we were created ad imaginem. In English we say in the image. I don't know what you say in French. It's probably closer to it. But ad imaginem means towards, plus the accusative case. It's movement towards. So from that, Bernard distinguished between a small I image and a large I image. And from this retained the idea that the basic thing about we who are small I images is that we have a movement towards the large image, which is the Word of God. In other words, innate in our nature is this movement towards God, ad Deum, ad verbum, ad imaginem. And if you want to be very technical, you can go into a lot of Platonic and Plotinian and Neoplatonic kind of theory on that score about why they considered this to be so, but I'm going to excuse you from that. You can read the Enneads after dinner in bed. It will certainly help your horizontal meditation. But they're just kind of just general things to bear in mind. There are three of the things. The Trinitarian aspect, which isn't important in the monastic teaching, it was important in the schools in the 12th century, and particularly in those who were derivative upon Augustinian thought. The notion of the distinction between image and likeness, and thirdly, this idea that being the image of God contained within itself a movement towards the imagehood of the Word. Now I'm going to just go back and say something a bit more general, reflecting what we said yesterday, about the doctrine of the Imago Dei. The most important part of it, as far as Bernard is concerned, is simply this, that human beings have by nature, I've already said this, but as I said, we used to call our classes repetitions, so here we have a bit of repetition. Human beings have by nature, that is to say, by God's gift, a pre-elective capacity and tendency by which the whole being is carried towards God. So we jump up and down a few times and say, this is very important. Everything that I say is very important, but this is very, very important. Because it's the basis of the whole spirituality, that it's there, we only have to uncover it, we only have to dig out the treasure from the field, as it were. We only have to allow it free scope, and it will carry us towards God. We don't have to bother so much about our own efforts, but we have to uncover the source of energy that is already operating within us. Human beings have by nature, that is by God's gift, a pre-elective capacity and tendency by which the whole being is carried towards God. Now, that is what we mean by desire. Desire for God, it's not primarily an affective reality, primarily it is an ontological reality. Not something at the level of psychology, but something at the level of being. Remember, we're at the moment in the 12th century, and the whole emphasis on thought right up to the 16th century was on being. It was only after that that it changed to consciousness. So when we're talking about desire for God, we're talking about this ontological lack, this ontological wanting, this ontological void that calls out for God. So to seek God, contact must be made with this innate desire. We must make contact with our own nature, with who we are, in order to find in it something that carries us towards God. If we remain in a state of alienation from ourselves, then all we can do is be good, which if any of you have ever tried it, you'd know is very boring and ultimately fruitless, because we can't keep it up for very long. Being good is just living according to the book, living according to the expectations of others. But that's not what monastic life or Christian life is all about, because being good is in fact an opposition to what we were made to do. It's setting up our own righteousness, as Paul says, in contradistinction to the righteousness of God. But the only way to go is to be a bit of a slob, in a sense, not to try to be too good, but to allow ourselves to make contact with the current of being that's already carrying us by nature towards God. You see, this is a fairly revolutionary kind of foundation for a spirituality, that trying hard is not the essence of a spiritual life. But the essence of a spiritual life is finding the reality of our own nature and allowing it to, identifying with it and allowing it to carry us to God. And it's a bit like trying to row a canoe across a river. We can't ignore the current. If we're clever, we make use of the current. If we're stupid, we try and beat the current and do the opposite to what the current wants us But we certainly can't ignore it. If we ignore it, it's at our peril. And the easiest way to get across a river is in some way to try and get the current to do our job for us, to start rather upstream and so forth. So, to seek God, contact must be made with this innate desire. Religion, therefore, is not an optional extra. It is the deepest level of being, beyond both thought and feeling. It's at this level of being. It's not just something, if it feels good, do it. If you like this sort of thing, it's exactly the sort of thing you'll like. That's not what religion is. It's not a choice. It's simply a matter of being faithful to what we are. Simply a matter of finding out what we are, created by God in His image, with a movement, a capacity and tendency by which the whole being is carried towards God. And so if I were to say, hands up all those who are naturally religious, I would hope that good Cistercians would all put their hands up. And they'd say, if there is any goodness in me, it's because it comes naturally. It's not because I have to try, but because it's there. This is the meaning of this doctrine, and we've got to wash out of our heads, use some soap and water, and just thoroughly cleanse our minds of all ideas that religion or goodness is a matter of striving. It's a matter of God's gift, which is already there, and what we have to do is make contact with the gift that we've been given and allow it to carry us, not to try and go it alone. It's not an optional extra, it's the deepest level of being, both beyond thought and feeling. Which is not to say that it doesn't come into thought and feeling, because it comes up from time to time into consciousness when the situation is right. But whether it comes up or whether it doesn't makes no difference. The fact is that it's there. Therefore, we go on to the next stage. Finding God is also finding self. Separation from God is the ultimate tragedy. Separation from God is alienation from God will necessarily mean alienation from ourselves. And this is kind of a revolutionary, highly countercultural sort of doctrine. And we've got to realize that. And that's why we have to bang our heads against the wall and knock some of our silly ideas out of them. Because it's revolutionary. It changes the whole direction of spirituality. Finding God is also finding self. Separation from God is the ultimate tragedy. And so we get back to the point which St. Paul is always making. His whole ethic is a matter of becoming what you are. Werd was du bist. Become what you are. You're already given it by nature, just let it be. Let it come out. Let it start to impress itself on your being. That's what it's all about. Not being good. Not trying harder. Come in here, brother, sit down there. I think you should try harder, brother. Try harder to be good now. All right, goodbye. Off you go. Next. There's my little oracle for the day. Well, that's not the scene at all. It's not a question of trying harder, but rather a question of finding out what it is that God has placed in our own hearts, a movement to Himself. And that means we have to work very hard with one shovel. So the first thing we need in the spiritual life is a shovel. So we go out and start digging to try and find it, and getting rid of all the muck, as it were, that clutters it up. Some of that muck is in our head, some of it's in our habits of action, some of it's in our value system. But to uncover the reality, the authentic gift of God, the first thing that we have to do is get rid of all the stuff that's covering it up. And if we don't do that, of course, God will do it for us. And fortunately, He does. Look at anybody who ever tried to be good. How long does it last? Fortunately, He doesn't let it last very long. If it does, it's the higher they climb, the harder they fall. But eventually they do. We'll be coming back to this later on. And that's the way God sets them up to make a start in midlife. if necessary. All right, let's just go, we're on to page 2 of this, and we finished at the second line, I think, yesterday, so we'll start on from there, lest any of the fragments be lost. Fundamental element in the requisite knowledge for living, there's a couple of copies up here, Ronnie. For living a spiritual life, as Bernard views things, is an appreciation of this innate spirituality. Not just a knowledge of it, but a real appreciation, so that it colours our choices. As we said yesterday, it colours our approach to prayer, our approach to virtue, and so forth. Humankind is called by God to be a nobilis creatura. So that's one of Bernard's favourite phrases, that we are really high-class people. We belong to the aristocracy of creation. And so, don't let the side down. Don't start acting like animals. Start acting like, as you really are, the lords and ladies of creation. Through the operation of grace, the hold of whatever belies this vocation is loosened and freedom is gained. One of the interesting things about Bernard is, if you asked him in a television interview, just while he was running somewhere, what is the goal of the spiritual life, probably he would answer freedom. Just in one word. I mean, if you want a sales point, if you want a marketing point for Bernard, what's he into? He's into freedom. And is so often, I mean, in the first parable, which we may get to look at, he just very simply gives the goal of spiritual progress as the steps towards freedom. And it's quite extraordinary the number of times he uses this word, especially in a 12th century thing. So, but what holds down our freedom is whatever limits our nobility, doesn't let us to operate at our full capacity, but which ties us down to only a part of what we are. Preaching of St. Paul follows closely the ethic espoused by St. Paul. Preaching of Bernard, become what you are. The frame of reference in which Bernard propounds his anthropology is that based on the scriptural statement of the creation of Adam in imaginum Dei. Bernard is not alone among his contemporaries in the importance he assigned to this theme. In fact, nearly all the major writers of the first Cistercian generation left behind them substantial treatises and teaching on the nature of the soul, and so forth, which developed and applied the traditional doctrine of imagehood. Hence it is a theme which has an extremely rich documentation. The book by Javelet, the 2 volumes by Javelet, he just mentions that he had collected 10,000 index cards with patristic citations of this theme, and he felt that he hadn't yet really begun. So 10,000 is the first beginning. It's just such a wide spread, and you could take, if you want a statement for a thesis, you try the image of God in Rupert of Seville, the image of God in whoever it is, and you probably find enough for a doctoral thesis there. Which means it's a very, very important theme, but nobody has ever, to my knowledge, present company accepted, got down and really traced the whole history of the theme. It's just too complex. Now, what we're going to do is look mainly at the later teaching of Bernard on the imagehood, because it's a bit better, and that's in the sermon on the Song of Songs. And we're just going to go through a number of texts and meander around and be very undisciplined, but just trying to get different points. And some of this may take a little bit of thought on your own part, just to try and get what he's saying, to see where it fits into the overall scheme of things, and most particularly to start applying it to your own life. Because really, unless you bring it to bear on your own values and so forth, it won't really sink in. Unless you allow yourself to be modified, challenged, nuanced a bit, then you're not really listening to what he's saying. So Bernard is constantly astounded by the thought of the vastness of the human soul. So it's a very large reality. It's not a skimpy little thing, but it's enormous. It's no trivial reality, but a capacity or potentiality created with a view to containing God. How big is the soul? It's as big as God. How do you know that? Because it was created to receive God. That's how big the soul is. So, we've got a volunteer to read the first text. Lisa, perhaps, would you like to read that first?
Oh, how great is the size of the soul, and how amply endowed with merits it is, that it is sufficiently capacious and has been found suitable to receive the divine presence within itself. How large is that which can provide suitable broad avenues for His Majesty to walk along. Such a soul cannot afford to become involved in lawsuits and in other worldly cares and causes, nor to give itself over to the belly or to sex. It must leave aside idle entertainment, the will for universal domination, and the pride which comes with power. For a soul to become a heaven, and thus become the dwelling place of God, it must first ensure that it is empty of all these other things.
Now, simple enough text, but let's just have a little look at it. So he begins with a kind of poetic vision, a vision of the soul, and in one sense we'll find that it parallels some of his descriptions of heaven. And later on in the text we'll see that the soul becomes a heaven. And this is the theme that we find in Augustine quite a lot, that the soul of the just is like a heaven. Why is it like a heaven? Because there's a lot of happiness there, yes, but more especially because God dwells there. So Bernard is saying, well, listen, God dwells there. Oh, how great is the size of the soul, how amply endowed with merits. And we all feel, he's talking about me. And so we feel pretty good about this. He's saying just understand that you're no small little thing like an ant or a bee. You're a large being. Huh? It's sufficiently capacious and it has been found suitable to receive the divine presence within itself. How large is that which can provide suitable broad avenues for His Majesty to walk along. End of the section, really. There's a little break there, and he says, if you're feeling pretty good, now fasten your seatbelts, because now we're going to get clobbered. Okay, you reckon that's okay? You say, yes, I'm pretty good, and God comes to live in me, and so forth. All right, he says, if that's what the soul is all about, if that's what our basic spiritual energy is about, then that's who you are. Then that should be reflected in the way that you live. So if you're such a great being, if you're such a noble being, you shouldn't get invest so many of your energies in trivial things, in trivial pursuit. You shouldn't be pouring yourself into little things that have no capacity to contain you. Such a soul cannot afford to become involved in lawsuits. Well, I think we can give ourselves a pat on the back there. I've successfully avoided lawsuits for a while. As far as I know, there are none hanging over my head. I'm not so sure about the rest. Or in other worldly cares and causes. I mean, he's saying, look to your purpose in life, look to your goal in life, look to the whole movement of your being, and you'll see that these bits and pieces of things about minor monastic politics, for example, or other small matters, getting het up about these things, about whether we walk in one door or out the other, whether the windows are opened or closed, whether we do the things this way or that way, or the liturgy is this or that. Getting involved in those sort of things eats up an energy which is really which is designed to carry us much further. It's like bringing in a forklift to move a small box like this. And I don't know what Canada is like, but sometimes in Australia with union laws and regulations and so forth that union members are not always allowed to lift boxes, although it may be quite a small box, but it belongs for somebody else to go and get a forklift and lift it up onto the truck and so forth. And you see this great big machine, you know, lifting a tiny little box which anybody could just take and put up. Well, that's what Bernard is saying. We're using great big bulldozer kind of energy, investing it in trivial things which don't matter. Such a soul cannot afford to be involved in lawsuits and in other worldly cares and causes, nor to give itself over to the belly or to sex. Must leave aside idle entertainment. So goodbye. The will for universal domination, you know, to be number one, to exercise power and so forth, and the pride which comes from power. Bernard is quite extraordinary, you know, the kind of little phrases he sometimes puts in, like the pride which comes from power. Very clear that if anybody has power, the great danger is that having that power, having that authority, even though it be only the authority of the assistant sub-sacristan, is sometimes the source of power, and sometimes the less power we have, the more pride. But, you know, a stripe on the sleeve, a title, an office, and all this kind of thing, it brings itself, you know, a feeling that I am really pretty well on top of things. But what he's saying is all these silly things shouldn't really eat up our energy. We've been given a quantum of energy, and we can either invest it in moving towards God or in trivial pursuits. That's our choice. And if we choose to occupy ourselves with all sorts of idiotic things, then our energy for moving towards God, our energy for experiencing God is diminished in proportion to that. And so the bottom line is, for a soul to become a heaven and thus become the dwelling place of God, it must first ensure that it's empty of all other things. So there is a role for detachment, a role for renunciation, but it's a renunciation that is built on a positive hope, on a positive movement towards something good. And this is a very important theme in Western spirituality, particularly from the time of Gregory the Great. And where he says, really, first of all, you discover the treasure in the field, and then you go off and sell everything you've got. You don't sell everything you got and start looking for the treasure in the field, because you'd still be looking. But generally, we let go of things, we allow ourselves to become detached, only because we've found something better. And, you know, the story I often tell is the story of a religious community who gave their television set away to a poor family in the parish. And what do you think of that? Was that an act of generosity, or where did they get that energy, or why would they do a thing like that? Anybody got... Pardon? But could you suggest, I'm thinking of a concrete case, what would you say? Why would they do that?
I think of one concrete case, it would be because they expect to have a better one.
Right. Or because not expect that somebody gave them a better one. They've already got it there, and they say, what do we do with this poor old television set? Well, we give it away. Now, in Western view, that is perfect detachment. Because you don't want the thing. You've got a much better one, there is absolutely no use for it. I think it's a bit different in monasteries, because everybody always has a use, or somebody always has a use for everything. You know, please leave the old cardboard boxes here. Glass jars and second-hand shoelaces and so forth. But the thing is, it's a very important point that's hidden under all this stuff, that once they get a new television set, then they are really detached from the old one. And so they can give it away. And that's what detachment is. It isn't necessarily saying no and hating it, but rather becoming interested in something else. It's not a question of just saying no, 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 but secretly saying up here, I wish I was, I wish I was, I wish I was. But rather it's a question of becoming progressively interested in something else. And we see this in ordinary human love affairs quite simply. That, you know, I can think of a case of my brother, for example, and to keep it impersonal. But one of the great struggles was to try and get him to have a haircut. And there is no way, this was many long years ago, no way he would have a haircut. But eventually he found a new girlfriend, and within a week he'd had a haircut. So, you know, with parents and everybody saying, you know, why do you have to leave your hair so long and so forth, he just said, you know, completely resistant to that. But when he got something to attach himself, then detaching himself from excess hair was a relatively simple thing. Now, it's the same with us. And this is what he's saying, the whole idea is that detachment is absolutely important, but it's only credible, it's only possible, it's only feasible to the extent that we've already become attached to something. We've lost interest in it. That's perfect attachment when you don't know if you've still got the bottle in your room or not. It's not that you know that you gave it away, but you just don't care whether it's there. And this is an important kind of qualification, because people can sometimes get terribly mixed up about this kind of thing. And the kingdom of God, as St. Gregory keeps pointing out, is like a man who found a treasure in the field. Good news is the beginning. And because of the good news, because he found the treasure, then he went off and sold his car to buy the machinery to dig up the treasure. It's as simple as that. And it's a bit the same with us. That first of all comes the hope, the discovery of the good things, and this gives us energy. This causes us progressively to lose energy in such things as lawsuits and other worldly cares and causes, the belly, sex, idle entertainment, the will for universal domination and pride. One thing about Bernard, his vices are always interesting. He always has a nice practical collection of vices when he lists them. Not abstract things, but sort of things that we can identify with. Okay, that's the first sort of text. The way he starts off with the notion of what the image of God is, what we are. We're created great, and therefore it's up to us as noble creatures to make sure that our way of life corresponds with that. Bernard, it will be noted, does not dwell long on the theoretical splendour of the soul. His instinct is to pass quickly onto its practical ramifications. The spirituality of the human soul, which is the immediate effect of its imagehood, elevates humankind to the level of the angels. And so we'll find this theme coming up quite a lot, that human beings are placed between material beings and the angels. And so if we live simply as beasts, if we live a bestial life, then we are denying a part of what we are by nature, because we were created to be companions with the angels. And monastic life itself, Bernard saw as a vita angelica, as an angelic life, not in the sense of a denial that we have flesh and blood or instincts or anything like that, but in the sense that all our will is directed towards God. All our energies are progressively invested in a spiritual direction. But above all these benefits, man was supreme because of the noble divine likeness which was his. It was this which gave him fellowship with the throng of angels and with the whole array of the heavenly host. So it's just a statement of the spirituality, of our spiritual aspect or facet of our being. Unfortunately, well, that's the good news, and you go on to the bad news. As unfortunately Bernard dolefully notes, he exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox which eats grass, quoting the Psalms. Hence, although the fundamental imagehood remained, the likeness to God and to the angels was obscured. and thus the former cultivator of paradise and lord of the earth and citizen of heaven, these are the titles that are ours by nature, assumes a pecorina similitudo. We become like the beasts. Pecorina, a bestial, a cow-like, a bovine similitude. And as we start chewing the cud. Later, Bernard will return to this theme, and in various ways. You have made him little less than the angels, Psalm 8. It's possible to interpret this text as a compliment to human nature in the sense that man was made in the image and likeness of God and endowed with reason, as the angels are. On the other hand, he is far from the angels because of his earthly body. Now this introduces a theme which we'll look at probably in the next segment, but a lot of people are rather alarmed by what Bernard has to say about the body, are rather alarmed by the fact that he seems to want to hang it up behind the door and leave it behind, and so forth. There was a thesis written at Fordham about 10 years ago by Emero Stigman, former Salesian, on this point exactly. How do you cope with Bernard's contempt of the world language and rejection of the body and contempt of the flesh sort of thing? Well, we won't cope with it this segment, but just to say we recognise that it is a problem, but it's mainly a problem of language and imagery. There's no theoretical problem. But just to bear that in mind, it's one of the things that people sometimes find hard, that Bernard seems to want to get rid of the old bod. Fallen man is thus doomed to live in the regio dissimilitudinis, the region of unlikeness, a Platonic term expressing something of the alienation experienced by the human being with regard to his environment and his sense of being enslaved by forces beyond his control which inhibit him in the pursuit of his goal. It's a good one to just try and stay with this one for a moment, to say to ourselves, what is this region of unlikeness? What are the experiences that I have in my own life that make me think of myself in terms of not really being able to accomplish the things of which I believe myself capable? All right, do you believe that you're capable of great spiritual things? Do you believe that you're capable of union with God and of being happy in it, of coming to life in union with God? So it's not just simply, oh God, I've got to sit here in heaven for eternity and gee. But actually that's the thing that really makes you come alive. If you believe that, then what are the sort of things that hold you back concretely? We won't ask you to tell us, but it would be good for you just to list them sometime for your own purposes, because then you begin to understand this concept that, well, we use with the Marxist kind of term alienation. But it's a good one. We don't quite fit in here because we really want to be somewhere else. But the whole thing, the sense of alienation, that there are things which inhibit our growth. All right, I see one or two of you haven't grown spiritually as far as you possibly could, that you haven't arrived at the peak of things. Well, ask yourself, what are the sort of things that have made you alien from what you could have been, that have held you back? And then you'll probably start to list the things that St. Bernard puts down as belonging to the region of unlikeness. You know, such things as we read in that first text, involved in lawsuits and business and worldly cares and causes, or giving yourself over to the belly or to sex or to idle entertainment or to power games with other people. These are the kind of things that hold us back, which make us fail to be the sort of people that God created us to be. And that sum total of things, they use that in the image of the Platonic image of the region of unlikeness. We live here in a kind of zone in which alienation, pollutes the atmosphere, and we kind of breathe it in as we live here. And so we're not really like ourselves. We can't really be ourselves. Let's read the next sentence again. Of the alienation experienced by the human being with regard to his environment, his sense of being enslaved by forces beyond his control, which inhibit him in the pursuit of his goal. I mean, we all love to be spiritual, wouldn't we? And we all have intentions of, wonderful deathbed conversion, and perhaps even 3 weeks of fervent living. Not too much. But we say, for the moment, I'm too busy. I've got cows to milk and chocolates to make and all this kind of thing, and studies to do and lectures to give, and just for the moment we'll put it off. Well, perhaps it's forces beyond his control which inhibit him in the pursuit of his goal. It's important to recognize that this is so, not only as a means to self-knowledge and humility, but as a realistic incitement to prayer, since without help there is no release. There's a wonderful phrase of St. Augustine when he talks about prayer and how prayer comes up, which is exactly this. He says, because we are human, therefore we are weak. Because we are weak, therefore we pray. And it's entirely the sort of things that Bernard is saying. Because we're human, my being ends here. My being ends here. Well, maybe in future we'll get a little bit out here, a bit more. It may extend, but my being is fairly limited. And it's limited in space and it's limited in time. And because I'm human, I'm weak and limited. And the thing that Augustine is saying is that it's this experience and acceptance and starting from this affirmation of my weakness that prayer is born. Prayer is never born out of an experience of strength, out of an experience of being top of the pile, out of an experience of making a great spiritual grade at last. That's delusion. It's not prayer. Prayer is only born out of the experience of limitation and weakness and powerlessness. And so it's an experience of one important aspect, not the only one, the important aspect of my humanity, that on the one hand I have unlimited desires, on the other I don't have the capacity to achieve these desires. And it's from that dilemma that prayer is born. It's a means not only to self-knowledge and humility, but as a realistic incitement to prayer. When I realize that I'm being held down by forces outside my ability to control them, then I begin to turn to God for help. And we will see this in Bernard a number of times in the text to come. The other thing in this point is beyond the natural things which we find in the region of unlikeness is the whole area of sin. Sin in an individual sense, sin also in a social sense, that a community can sin, can turn away from God just as surely as it can be converted, and even sin in a more cosmic sense that we find in Romans 5, for example. But I think we might have some idle entertainment now and have a little bit of a break.